Good morning and welcome to the second day of National Conveyancing Week and our second live session. For those of you who are watching us live streamed, the Slido login is hashtag HBSG UFI, all capitals. Please ask some questions later on. For those of you in the room, and there's hundreds here and thousands out there obviously, there is no fire alarm test today. Toilets and fire escape, turn right, turn left, run either way if you're in a hurry for either. Before we discuss the merits of upfront information, I would just like to say how pleased I am to see so many firms embracing National Conveyancing Week. Tomorrow morning, firms around the country will be opening their doors to welcome into their decorated offices clients, agents, and others who have an interest in the home buying and selling process. Conveyancers are no longer hiding their lights under a bushel. Turning the phrase "jack of all trades" on its head, with all the challenges and responsibilities the 21st century conveyancers now have to deal with, they have to be masters of all trades. This is the first of what I would hope to be a number of upfront information roadshows put together by the Home Buying and Selling Group. As many of you will know, I've been involved in upfront information since 2007 when HIPs were introduced. And I know for a fact that if you provide the right information, not just the information prescribed by the Housing Act 2004, but the information that a buyer and a conveyancer really needs, the home buying and selling process can work much better than it does now. So for the last 15 years, I've devoted much of my life to two things. Firstly, my wife, because we were married 2 days before HIPs were introduced. Bang went that honeymoon. And secondly, to upfront information. In fact, the word bold in Bold Legal Group stands for bundle of legal documents. However, I'm beginning to tire of banging the same drum over and over to ears that never seem to open. I'm therefore very thankful to the Home Buying and Selling Group and Beth, Kate and Glynis in particular, who have not only picked up the concept, but after many hours' work, improved on it drastically. Excuse me. I therefore ask you to erase from your memories any bad experiences or preconceived ideas you have about upfront information and open your shell lights as wide as they go today. However, we're not expecting you to simply lap it all up. The panel are ready, willing and able, I believe, to answer all of your questions fully. I'll introduce you to the panel after Beth makes a presentation. Thank you.
Was named after a bundle of legal documents. That's fantastic. So I'm Beth Rudolph. I'm the Director of Delivery for the Conveyancing Association and also honoured to be co-chair of the Home Buying and Selling Group along with Anna and also Kate Faulkner, OBE. The Home Buying and Selling Group was set up to help the Ministry identify, test and deliver things to improve the home moving process for the consumer. And of course, by improving it for the consumer, it will also improve it for all of the stakeholders. So I want to tell you about what we've been up to and how it all ties into everything else that's going on at the moment in the property market. I'm pleased to say that as part of the Home Buying and Selling Group, we have participants from all sectors of the industry. So it's been very much a holistic and collaborative approach, which means hopefully we've picked up on all of the things that can present an opportunity through the delivery of upfront information. But before we get on to the good bit, let's talk about the bad bit. Why do we need to do this? The big issue. Now, most of you in the room will, of course, know the transaction times at 22 weeks, 30% fall-through rates in England and Wales are pretty awful. When you think that your pipeline turn is probably 2.4 at the moment, whereas in the best of times, it's gone up as high as 6. And certainly when we had home information packs, our transaction times were 90 days. And because they were called hips, I got to make jokes about my hips and the fact these aren't my hips, these are my mother's hips, but we'll pass that one. So the big issue is trying to improve on those transaction times. But there are other things as well that we need to be aware of. Of course, home moving is in the top 3 most stressful things that we go through in our lives. The other two being death and divorce, but actually home moving comes top and yet is the only one with a positive outcome, unless your ex dies, of course. The average transaction time, as I say, 22 weeks, and the average national fall-through rate. That's huge. When you think how much time and money is wasted on those transactions that don't go ahead, we have to get rid of that. But we're battling in an analog world. So we have got duplication of documentation. Data that could be used all the way across the process is duplicated. And of course, this results in the collation of this documentation taking forever, which is why we have this 22-week process. And of course, these result in additional inquiries because of conflicting or missing information and conveyancers asking backwards and forwards. But of course, lenders also asking questions created by the valuers having to make assumptions which result in post-valuation queries, which nobody gets paid for. But they do add 21 days to the home moving process. And then, of course, we have got the media telling us all about our current economic issues and all the threats coming to the home moving industry. I'm delighted to tell you that actually, seasonally, the figures are as they were in 2018 at the moment. So the industry is really strong, and also all the concerns that we might have if there is a recession and house prices come down thanks to increasing interest rates are actually balanced out by the fact that we had that massive bubble thanks to the SDLT discount, which means that those people who might be moving house probably are not going to see any negative equity. And certainly if you've listened to anything that Kate talks about economic forecasting, she reckons we've got at least 10% price drop before anybody would have a negative equity issue. So good news all round. But what we are doing is we're moving from what's been a seller's market for such a long time to what will be a buyer's market. So apart from anything else, we do need to be thinking about how to make those properties look as good as they possibly can. So what's in it for you? What is going to come from the opportunities of upfront information? Well, it will make a huge difference. So for the consumer, it's going to increase certainty. And of course, we have talked about reducing the transaction times and fall-throughs. But that isn't what it's all about in and of itself. If you think at the moment, we get more information about a toaster when we look to buy it than we do about a house. How ridiculous is that? We also need to improve consumer confidence in engaging with the process. So all of those people, bedroom blockers as we call them, living in massive houses, will feel much more comfortable about downsizing if they understand that the process can be so much more straightforward and doable and certain and transparent. And of course, if we can provide all of that, we get that reduction in stress. So if you think about why people move, Kate will always say it's death, divorce, debt, babies, moving job. These are all stressful events. People are emotional when they get into the process, and that's before they hit all of those snags and barriers and uncertainty in the home moving process. So if we can get rid of that and enable them to have the certainty and the transparency that upfront information can deliver, then it will reduce the stress of the consumer, but also for all of us and all of our staff and all of our colleagues, not having upset people on the phone day in, day out. So what will it do for the stakeholders? Well, it improves profit. Of course it does. We're going to reduce all of those fall-throughs, reduce the transaction times, increase pipeline term. What does that mean? Well, if you think at the moment, to do a progress report on a transaction takes about an hour a week. Well, so immediately we're moving from a 20-hour progress report. If we can get it down to 12 weeks, we're taking 8 weeks off that. So that's 8 hours off that. So that's one full-time equivalent person. It makes a huge difference. And of course, we've also got the situation for the estate agents that they can lose 40% of properties that they put on the market because of fall-throughs or delay or whatever. So they will waste all of that time marketing those properties. So it sets that aside. It reduces liability. Now, liability is the first thing everybody talks about. Is it going to create increased risk to me, getting this information up front? What happened to buyer beware? And this is where we need to understand what buyer beware actually means. Buyer beware doesn't mean everything about a property. It just means that information specific to the buyer's intended use and enjoyment. Because as common law says, anybody selling a property needs to provide the information that an average consumer would want to know. And as the law says, under the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations, the estate agent, when advertising the property, must reveal everything that the average consumer would consider would impact their transactional decision. So buyer beware just squeezes down to those little things. Can I park my white van there? Can I keep a pig on there? So it's important that we understand the limits of buyer beware. Now, the good news is that when you speak to the PIO insurers, they will explain that by providing all the information up front, you reduce your liability, reduce your risk, because you're providing all of that information before the buyer goes to buy the property, and so they'll be buying in a calculated risk if it's a property that might impact their use and enjoyment, but it is in the right catchment zone for them, has the right number of beds. The other thing is that if they do complain, well, actually, you can prove, you have evidence that the information was provided to them and was part of the bargain. So you absolutely reduce the risk. And as I say, it reduces the additional inquiries and less stress. So what's happening? Why are we not doing this already? Well, some people are. So Simon Wilkinson at the Wilkinson Partnership has been doing this for years. And he reckons that his transaction times are down to 12 weeks. And we hear that all the way across the board. Those issuing sale-ready, contract-ready packs are finding that it makes a huge difference. But, of course, you can only move as fast as the slowest person in the chain. So if you come across somebody who isn't providing the information up front, then you're back to square one. So, talked a lot about upfront information, but what is it? Well, the important thing to note is that it's the information that is needed to be reviewed to identify the material information. Okay, so what's material information? Well, national trading standards have been working on identifying what material information is and setting out guidance for that. Material information, as I said, was referenced in the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations, so it is a legal requirement and has been since 2008. But of course, everybody's thinking now, well, why haven't we been doing this since 2008? Well, it was actually the leasehold mis-selling scandal that brought it up to the visibility of government and of national trading standards that it wasn't being provided. And that's why we ended up with all of those new build buyers ending up with escalating ground rents and things like that, which was that huge problem. So that's why we haven't seen any enforcement up till now. But national trading standards are doing sterling work, working with industry to work out how to get that information and how to get it on the portals. And I'll go into that a bit later. So, to be able to identify the upfront information, we've created the buying and selling property information. So that is a data set that collates all of the information. It's probably about 220 questions about the property for the seller to fill in. The really good news is that we also have a fantastic technology subgroup in the home buying and selling group. And so they've created a schema that enables the system to identify which of the questions to be asked. So, for example, if the seller is selling a freehold property, doesn't need to answer any of those leasehold questions. They've also created a property data trust framework, which will ensure that the provenance of that data can be authenticated. So if the estate agent's technology pings a BASPI to the seller to complete, then the seller's conveyancer can review that data and identify whether it came from the land registry and therefore is totally reliable, or whether it came from the seller and so probably needs to be double checked. So the BASPI comes in two parts. Section A is the information that is the material information that the buyer would need to see before, on advertisement of the property. And then part B is the rest of the information. As I say, there are about 200 questions, but it's very different from, for example, the Law Society TA6 form, which is very much focused on what the lawyer needs to know to be able to advise the client, whether that is the buyer or the lender. Because of the data set, it does enable all of those forms, so like the estate agent PIQ from Property Mark or the Law Society TA6, or RICS have also helped us create a valuer's summary to be pre-populated from the BASB. And it is updated annually to ensure that it reflects anything that is happening in the marketplace. So, for example, last year we updated it to include questions about spray foam insulation because we heard that transactions were falling through because of that. So, how do we know what national trading standards need and will be putting out as guidance for material information? Well, they've already got a little bit there. So Phase A was published last year in June, and that requires the financial information about the property, so things like the price, tenure, council tax band to appear on the adverts. And all of the portals are working with national trading standards to ensure that they can collect that information. What needs to happen now is the estate agents' technology, the CRM providers, need to make sure that they can pass that information through and collect it. Phase B and Phase C are coming down the tracks. They'll probably come at the same time so that the development time is reduced for all of those systems. And they will include in Phase B, that will be the rest of the information that applies to every property. So utilities, parking, broadband, that sort of thing. And then Phase C is where it goes to everything else. So probably going to be restrictions on the property, not just legal restrictions on covenants, but restrictions from, for example, it being a listed building or it being in a conservation area. And then anything else that would be material to the average consumer. Now, average is a really tricky one, isn't it? So, you know, it's supposed to be the Clapham omnibus kind of approach, but at the end of the day, if you just think, what would everybody want to know? So things like coastal erosion, environmental impact, flooding, they're going to want to know if the property's going to flood, they're going to want to know if it's going to fall into the sea. But at the moment, the steering group of National Trading Standards, the State Letting Agents team are working that through, and hopefully we will see that coming through probably Q3 this year, so that it can go live. But to be able to identify the material information from all of that, what do we as conveyancers, as estate agents need to be looking at? So the upfront information is a list of all of the prescribed documents that would have to be reviewed to identify what things apply to that property that would be material information. So we've created a finite list. Again, it will be iterative because as we discover other things that cause the average consumer an issue, or the average lender, let's face it, then those will appear on there. So we've got the property information, so that's the BASB. As I say, that could be delivered in a variety of different ways. Then you've got the title and plan, the searches, and then confirmation that the seller's identity has been reviewed. And certainly the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology are just going for legislation for the digital ID trust framework, and that will enable the identity of the seller to be proved digitally, but also certified so that the seller can pass that to all of the stakeholders in the process. Now, why is this important? Well, apart from it being such a nightmare for the customer journey, having to take a different ID to different people, actually, as a buyer, I think the average consumer would want to know if they were being asked to pay the money to a fraudster instead of the real owner of the property. So it's important that the seller has been identified. And then, of course, there's the EPC, which is already in legislation, and any shared amenity information. So that might be collected through an FME1 or LPE1 or the Law Society TA7 form. So this is just an example of how it could be, because as estate agents, we all know that actually there's not that much information that would be relevant to a property. And this is the important thing to note, is that because it can be delivered digitally, thanks to the Property Data Trust Framework, then that data then can be reviewed by AI to ensure that only the material information is displayed that is relevant to the property. So that means that we get rid of that irrelevant technical documentation that we had with home information packs, where the consumer had absolutely no idea what it meant. We can now create exception summaries, which will tell a buyer of 45 Arley Close that the property is freehold. So it's going to tell them good stuff. There's no shared amenity charge involved in the Arley Close property. And the authority information shows that it has got a conservation area, so the buyer may want to double check if they're thinking of extending or altering the property. And then information from the seller's knowledge and the parking. So it's really straightforward. It's not something that is going to cause too much problem. But how are we going to deliver it? Before we go on to that, though, what about busting some myths? So hopefully you're all on Slido already on the Q&A for the panel session later. If not, don't forget, it's HBSG UFI to get onto the Slido. Raise your questions, but we know the ones that come up regularly. So these are like our frequently asked questions. Ta-da! So the first one that we get is, well, hang on, if the BASB is completed by the estate agent, then is the conveyancer's regulator going to be able to collect it and accept it? Well, we reached out to all of the regulators, and the SRA, the CLC, Silex all confirmed that it's entirely up to the law firm how they collect their due diligence. And so the BASB is absolutely fine for that. The next one is that the seller's searches won't cover the buyer and the lender. Well, I'm delighted to say, again, absolutely no problem at all. If it's a local authority search done by the authority itself, then the indemnity that the authority offers will cover anybody reliant on it. And if it's a personal search, then so long as it complies with the standards of the search code, then it will have insurance which will cover anybody relying on it also. And the regulators are very clear that it's entirely acceptable for conveyancers to use searches provided by the seller, so long as they're in date, obviously, and also that the lender will accept it. And the good news is that 96% of mortgage instructions issued will accept a personal search. The other good news is that the majority of transactions, 90%, do complete from listing within 6 months, and so the searches will be fine. But for those that don't, most of the private search companies will do a refresher search, and of course with the land registry, local land charges, they're again enabling you to double check and refresh those elements of the search. So it's all there. The big myth, of course, is the seller won't pay. Nobody wants to put money in the pot. Again, we've double-checked. We did surveys, and I'm delighted to say that of the respondents, 98% thought that upfront information was a great idea. 62% of them would be happy to pay over £300 for that upfront information. People who were actually moving at that time, because we asked people when they'd last moved, of those, 78% were more than happy to pay over £300 to enable upfront information. And the other interesting thing from that survey was to note that the majority of the people who were answering it would be sellers. And so they are quite happy to pay for that upfront information. Of course, we've already tested those, though, haven't we, in the HIP regime. And I'm sure Rob will tell us, but we had no problem with sellers paying for home information packs. And of course, when Scotland brought in home reports, they're much more expensive than what we're talking about here, and yet they have no reduction in the number of transactions that completed before, during and after the delivery of home reports comparable to England and Wales. So we know that it made no difference there. Although it's worth noting that we don't have any historic data on how many properties went on the market, but definitely the same number completed. So the estate agents were getting paid, but maybe the time wasters didn't instruct on some of them. So the next myth is it doesn't make a difference to timescales or fall-throughs. Well, first things first, actually upfront information is not really there to provide that. It is there to ensure that you can get more information about a house worth on average £300,000 than you can get on a toaster currently. But the good news is that it will reduce transaction times. As we saw, Simon Wilkinson's been doing this for 3 years, 12-week transactions. We hear it all the time. So it's well worth doing. Will it reduce the fall-throughs? Well, in Scotland, where upfront information is provided through the home report, it has reduced their fall-throughs by 60% compared to what we've got here. So yes, it makes a difference. If you look at places, other jurisdictions where they do it, so Australia, Denmark, Norway, it reduces it so much they don't even record the number of fall-throughs. Even in the vendor disclosure states in Australia, they talk 2%, no more than that in fall-through. So we know it will make a difference. So how are we going to do it? Because that's the tough bit, isn't it? Everybody's probably sat there now thinking, well, hang on, I saw that great big long list of documents. I'm an estate agent. I don't know how to do that. What we need to do is work together. Collaboration is key on this. But technology is the enabler. And there is technology out there which will gather in all of that upfront information and work its AI magic on it to identify the exception summaries. So how would it work? So the estate agent goes out to list a property and gets the seller to complete the BASB via a URL link. So just literally an email. His system probably even does it all for him, and maybe even orders the searches, the EPC and the digital ID at the same time. They will encourage the seller to instruct a conveyancer on day one of marketing. And this is one of the pledges from the home buying and selling group. And this is to ensure that the work can start from the beginning, so that the conveyancer can look through that and identify the material information that the seller will need to display, and that the estate agent has a legal obligation to provide an advertisement of the property. But while they're doing it, they can also point out to the seller that they've got a 69-year lease, and maybe they want to have a think now about whether they want to extend it or not, and just set the expectation that if they don't, well, they need to be prepared there could be a delay in the transaction later on. There is obviously no obligation on the seller to fix their title. We're not saying that that has to happen, but being enabled to does make a huge difference. And we've seen that in Scotland through the delivery of the home report and the amount of work that sellers will do to their properties to ensure that they can get the best market price for it. So the conveyancer reviews it, provides the information to the estate agent, puts it on the adverts, and then the vendor then gets to get the best possible price for their property. Anybody viewing the property will see the material information through the portals, and certainly Rightmove, Zoopla, Boomin, all of them are on board with this. Certainly in terms of Phase A, Phase B and Phase C of the National Trading Standards once those last two are published. But of course, because that information is available, then it means that the valuer, before they go out to do the valuation for the buyer, if they get their offer accepted, will then be able to look through that information and avoid creating assumptions. So if they're valuing on the basis of a 69-year lease, then it means that the post-valuation query doesn't go out later, telling them that it's not a 100-year lease. Or the classic, in the mortgage offer, it's assumed that all local authority consents have been obtained for this extension or alteration, when actually they haven't. If we know that already, then the valuer can value on the basis of the true position of the property, which of course takes that 21 days off 30% of transactions where there are post-valuation queries. And that means we get to exchange contracts quicker, which hopefully then means that we can have a decent time between exchange and completion, which will then enable us to meet another pledge of the home buying and selling group, which is to try and deliver completion by 1 p.m. so that everybody is moved in by 1 p.m. on the day of completion. That's the plan anyway. And that hopefully will create a positive home moving experience for all. The technology is out there for this. And we have all of these companies who have identified to us that they are able to assist in the provision of upfront information. Many of them work to the Property Data Trust Framework and all of the schemas that the technology subgroup have provided, so that it means that we can rely on all of that through. So I'd say reach out to these technology companies and ask them what you need to do. There will be a flyer sent out to everybody who attended today, both virtually and in the room, with the next steps to help you speak to your colleagues about how to deliver upfront information and hopefully create a positive home moving process for all. So, Rob, back to you for the questions.
Okay, thanks, Beth. I'm just going to pull a chair over so I can put my gubbins on it because I've got too much clutter. and there will be no seat for anybody. So what I'd like to do now then is just remind you, well, Beth reminded you of the hashtag HBSG UFI. If you want to ask a question in the room here, would you please use one of the roving mics? There's two. Even though I can hear you, the online audience can't hear you, so please put your hand up and ask a question with the mic or via Slido. So I'd now like to introduce you to the panel, and in no particular order. First of all, Anna, if you could join us. So we have Anna Badgery, Head of Sustainability at Countrywide Surveying Services. Glynis. Glynis Frew, the ex-CEO of Hunters, Estate Agents, and now Franchise Training and Development Director for the Property Franchise Group. Robert, at the end there. Robert Sinclair, Chief Executive, Association of Mortgage Intermediaries and Association of Finance Brokers. John Horton, Product Director at the TM Group. Don't worry, Beth, I'm not going to leave you out. And you've all met Beth Rudolph. Beth, who is licensed conveyancer, ex-estate agent, Director of Delivery for the Conveyancing Association, and co-chair of the Home Buying and Selling Group. We have got questions coming in on Slido, which is great. Keep them coming in, please. But before we cut to the questions, I'd like to ask all the panelists, one at a time, two questions. That is, what is wrong in your industry now with the information, the way it's delivered, and how will upfront information help? So let's start with you, please, Anna.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Nice to see everyone face to face. It feels quite surreal. I think last face-to-face event was about 3 years ago, so just over that. So thanks for having me in the panel. I'll be wearing a couple of hats for this one. I think, obviously, I'm co-chair with Beth for the Home Buying and Selling Group and have been so for the last few years, and quite passionate about improving the home buying process as a whole. So that's one hat. The other hat is from a surveying perspective. Prior to joining Countrywide, I worked with the RICS for about 9 years and was responsible for developing standards for the property sector that included the home survey standards, so looking at the condition-based advice. And obviously head of sustainability, so I can't really talk without actually integrating some of the sustainability principles into all of this discussion. So what's happening in our sector? I've seen a couple of surveyors obviously in the room as well. So what is happening in our sector, and Beth accurately pointed out, is the aspect of post-valuation queries. So when a valuer gets an instruction, they obviously go out to do a physical inspection, and then we find out, based on the assumptions, that queries come in from the lender or the conveyancer, which means that we get that added time. And undoubtedly, PVQs, post-valuation queries, cause a lot of issues for everybody, including the back-end operations from a surveying perspective, but also the headaches that it causes for the conveyancer. What we are still seeing is sort of large volumes in terms of post-valuation queries around things like tenure, around things like service charge, and various common things that we all are very familiar with. And given that the information, the upfront property information will provide, it enables the valuer to not have assumptions, as Beth highlighted, so I don't want to repeat the stuff that you've said, but it improves that overall efficiency and provides that clarity that's needed for the valuer and therefore the lender. When this piece of work started to kick about with Beth, we did do a review with some of our large surveying firms, looking at what is the material information to a valuer. And Beth talked about the inclusion of the important information for the valuer within the BASPI, so that the valuer is not spending time reviewing unnecessary information to enable them to deliver the valuation within their service level agreements. So going back to what is happening at the moment, obviously there's still a large volume in terms of post-valuation queries. Efficiency levels can be compromised if we don't have that upfront information that's readily available to the valuer within the transaction. Just linking back to the time that's spent with the post-valuation queries. Other potential issues that can come down the track is information around, again, bringing in the sustainability hat and the environmental risks that Beth mentioned about, what's important to a consumer, and obviously highlighting how we as surveyors can have that information up front. We also, on behalf of the RICS, almost 4 years ago, we did do a consumer research piece which highlighted the information that the buyer would want to know, and a survey from the seller ranked up quite high. So when it comes to the information that a buyer is keen to find out when purchasing a property, they also want to have condition-based advice as part of that process, which is why not just the valuer, but actually the surveyor information is going to be critical in this as well. Sorry, that was quite long, but hopefully it captured everything. You don't need to ask me anything else now.
That's okay. Thank you, Anna. So, Glynis, from the estate agent's point of view, what's wrong now, and how will upfront information help them?
Well, I think what's wrong now, is it's just not right for the customer, and the customer is everything because they pay all our bills at the end of the day. And it's the biggest transaction that most of us ever make, and it's not just a transaction that happens this day or this week. This is often a transaction that people are committed to for 20 years and more. And so I think it's respectful that the customer should get the information that they actually need for that property. I think from an estate agent's point of view, when I first went into estate agency, Beth was quite right when she said, the pipeline would turn between 4 and 6 times a year. When this pipeline is churning at the lowest rate that it is now to maybe 3 times a year, that affects profitability to the point where some small businesses cannot cope with that lack of cash flow. So the two things combined, because an estate agent does provide a service, a good service for good estate agents for the consumer. The customer should expect that they can have the information that they would want to know about that property up front, and then they would expect that the process is easy to follow. And it could be so much easier than it is now. So for me, it's about the customer, and obviously being an estate agent, it's also about agency. And, the UK is full of small businesses, and agency is certainly one of those because there's about 20,000 agents in the country.
Okay, thanks, Glynis. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you from estate agents and others. We do have a 6th panelist now who's joined us online, which is good news. We've got Emma Cook from Trading Standards. So if you've got any questions about the material information, send them through on Slido or ask them with the mics. We can ask Emma, hopefully, via Slido, or she'll hear us. Robert, if you could answer those 2 questions as well, please, from your point of view, which I presume is the mortgage brokers.
Yeah. I'll start with another element of this, which is actually as a consumer. The fact that I actually live with somebody who wants instant gratification on most retail purchases would drive, if we were to move house now, it would drive her to distraction. We should think that something she really wants to move to would take 6 months. It is bonkers that you're making this huge investment of a huge amount of money, and we make a consumer wait 6 months to get the thing they want. And we are all to blame for that in this element. And therefore we have to think that through about what will happen to us if we don't change this, or what could happen to us within the industry if we don't make those changes. From a lender and mortgage broker perspective, the thing that goes wrong most often is because the time of transaction has now gone out and out and out, we rub right up against now the limit of most mortgage offers that come into the transaction. The people that I represent only get paid when the transaction completes, and therefore they are always on the phone to the conveyancer to try to make sure this can be, to the estate agent trying to get the amount of noise that goes on day in, day out, week in, week out, of people chasing things because people are sitting on things is value destructive to a degree I cannot believe we've let it get this bad for so long. Therefore, we need to change. This isn't nice to do, this is have to do, otherwise we will be seen as dinosaurs and things will happen around us to change us. The last element of that is that last bit I talked about, which is when offers expire, what then happens to that customer? Because we're going to face more and more into a more volatile lending environment, because for 15 years we've had a very benign mortgage environment where rates were continually going downwards, more and more lenders were coming to the market, everything was easy. Guess what? We're into issues where lenders do not and cannot get money and funding at the moment. Securitization markets are not closed, but they're very tight. You will find a whole load of lenders, and we did find it as we went through the trustonomics period, where transactions could not complete because lenders were not prepared to or could not complete. We will face into this periodically, I think, over the next 5 years. This means that unless we speed this up and get it right, we all face claims from customers for failure to do our job with due diligence. And this is why Amy sits as part of the Home Buying and Selling Group, as fundamentally wanting to be involved in trying to impel change here. Because I fundamentally believe that it has to happen. And if we don't do it, that's where we'll end up in bad places with consumers more and more upset because we lose them the finance for the house that they really want.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So John, from the technical point of view, is this possible? Can we do it?
Yeah, we can, and we are doing it. I mean, one of my biggest frustrations, I've been in the industry for over 20 years, and one of the biggest frustrations is the adoption of the technology. It's advanced in leapfold, particularly over the last couple of years, and I often hear this word collaboration as well. Well, the technology is the enabler for collaboration. So if you don't get the adoption with the technology, you're going to fail on a lot of the collaboration because it's the technology that links all of this together and actually makes it quite easy and straightforward. And if it's easy and straightforward, you know, service levels go up and the consumer experience goes up and everyone benefits.
Okay, so without naming names, if you're a lawyer sat in their office, how and where do they get the tech? There are other service providers out there, obviously, but how easy is that to do for, we've got a cottage industry, haven't we? We've got 3,000 conveyancers who may not be, or 3,000 firms, really tech savvy.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there is a bit of a learning curve there. There's a sort of educational piece that sort of sits around this. There's no question about it. But, you know, there is integrations with various legal case management systems that's available. But if you look at perhaps where the journey starts in the home buying and selling process, very often, logically, it starts with the estate agent. And some of the technology solutions that, you know, we've developed and that are available to estate agents means that it's all digital, it's all online, it's very, very easy to get an online property information form completed at the very earliest stage, and then to be able to share that information at the touch of a button with the seller's conveyancer, and later on in the process with the buyer's solicitor, and early in the stage with the mortgage broker and the surveyor. So it's there, it's available, and it's evolving all of the time.
And it's not expensive.
It's not expensive.
Okay, good.
No.
Beth, I'm not going to ask you the same questions because you probably covered most of them in your presentation, but I will ask you a couple of the questions coming up on Slido before we go to the room and see if there's any questions here. So the first one that came in was, how long will the BASB information be valid for? Is there a need to update it if a sale falls through?
So just, you know, I know you didn't want to ask me about how it impacts the conveyancers, but can I please just put a shout out for all the conveyancers out there who have been through hell over the last 3 years. If you think of that stamp duty discount, if you think of the number of people that have left the industry because of the emotional stress and the mental impact of it all, that is why it has been so difficult, because of all these additional inquiries. And then you have new trainees coming in who have to learn the experience and gain the experience. And of course, they're working from home so many days. So it's a lot slower, it's much harder. And you've got the conveyancers really up against the wall trying to push the transactions through, whilst at the same time trying to manage the fact that they don't have the resources available to do that. So for technology to be coming in that will help them, but also help the trainees, it will make a huge difference. I get really excited about the exceptions summary and the augmented intelligence being able to take out the relevant information, not just because it's going to provide it for the consumer, but also for the trainee conveyancers and the administrators being able to see, oh, this property's got a conservation area. I know that I need to do the next thing on that. It will make life so much better. And trying to work with an analog process where we used to at least have deeds packets. We don't have deeds packets anymore. They disappeared with the dematerialization of deeds at the beginning of the century, which now means that when we come to answer additional inquiries, we have to go and get and recreate the history of the property from all of the things that have gone before. Yet those transactions have managed to go through. You know, most properties have at least sold 4 times, at least many of them have sold hundreds. So those issues have been resolved already. And it used to be when you and I started conveyancing, you would
They
go
were
and,
different eras, Mark.
you would go and get the deeds packet out, and you'd get the dead file out, and you'd be able to get old searches out and guarantees and answer all of the inquiries. Now, the one thing we haven't spoken about today is property logbooks.
Are you going to answer the question?
I will.
Sorry, it's okay.
But, you know,
Someone out there is fuming at the moment.
this
but,
gives
yeah.
us the opportunity, with the digitisation, all of this, to create digital deeds packets, basically. And so please do ask questions about those as well. We have logbook suppliers in the room. So the question was, what was the question actually, Rob?
If it was so long ago, I've forgotten. Will the BASB information go out of date and need renewing if there's a fall through?
Yeah, what we're saying is in the same way that conveyancers would include in the standard contract that the property information is incorporated. What they would do, therefore, when the BASB goes to them, they would say to the seller, is it accurate? Is it up to date? And make sure that it is updated. Because, of course, the seller will receive notices and stuff like that from the council if anything's happening locally, and so they would be triggered. But also, because of the technology and the schema that the technology subgroup has provided, it can populate the BASB from the authority data so that if stuff has changed, it can be updated real time in the best case scenario.
At a cost or not?
I don't know. You would have to go out to those technologies and ask them. But we've got them in the room, so if you want to ask anybody.
All right, maybe come to that in a second then.
But yes, you would check that it was up to date and accurate, as you would with any property information form currently.
All right, just one more question for you before we move on to someone else. And I think you may have touched on this in your presentation. Somebody said, what about buyer beware? So.
Yeah, so as I said, the thing about buyer beware is that we make it so big and based on everything, and that is what has created the lack of proactivity that impacts the conveyancer, because, you know, when you're acting for a seller, you're looking through the title and thinking, oh, that's a bit dodgy, but I can't do anything about it now because it may be the buyer won't mind or isn't interested. Actually, we know that that is not what the law says. So there was a case, I think it was the year before last, it was the SPS Groundworks case that pointed out that the seller has a responsibility to provide information to the buyer, either that would impact the average consumer, or if that buyer has said to them, I want to develop the property, is there anything that you know that might prevent me? If the seller doesn't then say, well, yeah, I've got that information, then they're stuffed. So there is that common law thing that you have to provide all information up front. The estate agent has a legal obligation also under the regulations to provide it at the point of advertising. So buyer beware only applies to the specific use and enjoyment of that buyer. And if the buyer says to the seller, well, I'm thinking of, or I've got to park my white van on there, then if the seller knows of any reason why they can't, they have to advise them of that.
Okay, thank you.
That's an interesting point that Beth makes. It's all very well collecting this data in an easy format, but it's being able to use it in a constructive way. And certainly speaking to Simon Wilkinson, you know, he cited that his team in his agency branch were able to sort of refer to it whilst they were out on viewings. And where previously, you know, interested parties viewing a property would be asking detailed questions about the property, and there was a sort of bit of a blank look and, oh yeah, not too sure, I'll have to get back to you on that. You know, again, it didn't really lend itself to the best consumer experience, because I've instructed you because you're the property expert, surely you know all there is to know about this property. Now they're able to actually take their tablets out on a viewing and refer to the property information questionnaire in great detail so that they can inform prospective buyers. So it is about, from an agent's point of view, and I think Glynis might back me up on this, it is about perhaps saving time and actually trying to narrow down and work with, you know, the best, most suitable, proceedable buyer, because they're going into a transaction with their eyes wide open rather than half shut with their arms tied behind their back, hoping and praying that nothing, you know, comes out of the woodwork 12 weeks or umpteen weeks further down in the process.
And that was an interesting thing about some research that the ministry did about upfront information and things like that. And they said that consumers felt that they psychologically had the right to pull out without it being any cost to them, because they didn't know what the bargain was at the moment. They didn't know the lease term. They didn't know whether they could use the property as they wanted. So they just assumed that they would pull out if it wasn't okay. Whereas if they've got that information up front, they're much more tied into it. And, you know, we talked before about the timescale. You think the economic stasis created with a 22-week transaction time where the buyer can't buy a sofa, can't get their kids into school, can't book a holiday because they might have to complete in that week. It gets rid of all of that, so that, as John says, you end up with a buyer that has got their eyes wide open and they're good to go.
Glynis, you were going to say something, I think.
Yeah, you know, I think that's quite right about the property information form. That's something that Property Mark do for estate agents that are part of them, and you can go and, you know, you can use this as a document which helps the agent and, of course, the buyer. And I think that's quite right. And there's a lot of agents and a lot of conveyancers that are in sale ready or contract ready that Beth mentioned before. I think what we're proposing here takes both of those and really sort of takes them you know, faster and farther than ever before. Because what we're saying here is, and you'll probably remember a chart that was up that Beth produced, which had I think it was the agent in the middle, because, you know, as John was saying, agents are usually first, and then there's the vendor, and there's the conveyancer, and there's the buyer, and there's the lender. And because this thing that we're proposing now with the Property Data Trust framework and the information that is available it is available digitally. A lot of it, and I don't know how much, but there's some here that might be able to say how much, can actually be you know, completed digitally, automatically, brought in from Land Registry and so on, because I haven't met a vendor yet, including myself, who when they see the 200 questions think, oh, how lovely, I've got all these to fill in. So the more that as an industry we can make it easy for the customer, because it's all about the customer, and then we make it easy for ourselves, then the better it will be. But I agree with everything that, you know, that everybody's said. But, you know, and would have to say that what we're trying to create here as an industry really takes us way, way further than we are now and could ever dream of being. But that's absolutely the right thing for the customer and for us as an industry.
That sounds quite scary, doesn't it? 200 questions. You know,
Yes, it does.
Yeah. In actual fact, you know, the BASB data set, when it's transposed into an intelligent form, it's 12 questions in part A. Okay. Now, yes, depending on how much information you've consumed from other sources. So, for argument's sake, if you reach out to Land Registry and pull back a copy of the register in a digitised format, well, you've got absolute provenance of the data there, and you can pre-populate a lot of the information relating to some of the title.
30% in Part A you can populate from authority data.
So it's not 200 questions because it's 12 questions, but it's intelligent because based on answering yes or no, you'll get some further questions or you'll bypass that and go straight through. So the reality is for the average property out there in terms of completing it, it's not an onerous task. And let's face it, the seller at some point is going to have to complete a form of this nature. Yeah. So you're better off doing it right at the outset. And it shows that commitment as well.
That leads very nicely on to another question here. Is the BASB something to complete in addition to other protocol forms, e.g. TA6 or PIQ? So they have to complete those as well.
Not necessarily, no. I think Beth referred to the fact that the BASB as a standard is accepted by a number of the different regulators, and it's down to the lawyer to decide whether they're comfortable with the level of due diligence and the forms that they're using. Now, of course, if you've got that information, transposing it into another format, you know, we talk about property marks, property information questionnaire. Well, that's just their variant of a buyers and sellers property information form. You know, at MEO, we call it a property information form. You know, it's the same thing, it's just got a different badge on it. So transposing it into, you know, a TA6 is not rocket science.
And it is possible, and that's the whole point, is that all of the TA6 questions are answered in there. We're just doing version 4 of the BASB, which will be published at the end of this month, and that will ensure that every single one of the TA6 questions can be answered from the BASB if the solicitor wants to use a TA6. But of course, remember that using the TA6, you know, solicitors will want to do because of the conveyancing quality scheme, but they'll still need to know about the rest of the answers from the BASB if it's material information.
Now, I know you chose me as chair because I'm the lowest common denominator on lots of things, and I asked the stupid question, so this is probably a stupid question, but will the TA6 be filled in automatically then once the BASB is completed, or could it be?
Yeah, if the technology is there. I mean, does MEO BASB do that yet?
Not yet, that's the next stage. But it can do, because it depends who's consuming that information and in what format do they want to consume that information. So yes, we've got the data set, the BASB. I want to receive that information from you in the form of a TA6. Then it can take that information and transpose it. It's just integrating with the Law Society's TA6,
Okay.
which is in pilot at the moment.
Rob, there are technology providers in the room who may well be able to answer that question. Can I ask you?
I was just going to say, Beth, we've been ignoring the audience in the room, and now I'm going to ignore the audience online. So does anybody have any questions or comments to make about what's been said so far? What Beth has just said. Can we get the mic over to the mic to Mike, please?
Mic to mic.
And if you could just say who you are and where you're from, that'd be great.
Thank you. Stand up actually as well. Yes, my name's Michael Holden. I'm a chartered surveyor. So I carry out surveys of properties. Anna, it's not a trick question, I promise you. I'm also President-elect at Property Mark as well, NEA. So the one thing I've heard that I'm is the cost side of things. You know, 300 quid, you know, to get a information pack together. And it sort of throws me into, you know, my colleague across the room there, Alan Milstein, who's RPSA. I think, personally, that there should be a condition-based survey before we start on this process. I can only just say I've just been with one of my sons, William, at a property yesterday, and the cacophony of defects in that property that have been skimmed over is scary. And Eddie looked at a property where part of the chimney's been removed, you know, flue system, and there's no information on that. And all it'll do is stop the job down the line there. So I would just like to ask what your views are on that, please. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Hand the mic back. Mike. Anna.
Obviously, Mike knows how passionate we've been about the fact that condition survey needs to come a lot earlier in the transaction process, not only that it's essential for the buyer to get that certainty in the asset that they're purchasing, but actually that's supported by the insight that we captured from consumers, that actually people would like to have as much condition-based advice as possible. There's still that confusion between a mortgage valuation and a home survey. It still exists out there. People still get confused. So I think giving the consumer that added certainty on what they're buying is absolutely essential. I would just like to add that all the work that we've done on the home survey is actually complementary to the upfront information part. As Mike and Alan would know, there's a huge engagement that takes place between a surveyor and a buyer in relation to capturing some upfront information before going to an inspection. And I think, given that we hope that more condition-based information, more condition-based surveys will be out there available for both buyers and sellers, that information that's contained in the BASB will support the surveyor when going out there to do that inspection. In fact, we went a little bit further with the publication of the Home Survey Standard, where we sort of highlighted some of the key areas for the surveyor to explore before going to an inspection, and it was very much aligned with the upfront property information contained within the BASB. In my view, all of our efforts are obviously consistent in the fact that we all want to provide the best service possible to the consumer. And I think this way we are adding further clarity, but also removing a duplication of effort. So if a surveyor, if Mike's going out there and capturing all of this upfront information before doing a physical inspection for a home survey, how much more time could that reduce if that information is readily available pre-instruction? And then given the Scottish system, if a condition-based survey is incorporated, and obviously HIPS is way before my time, but I'm trying to imagine what that scenario would look like. I'm really sorry, but it's the truth, and I can't sit here and sort of pretend that I know exactly how HIPS would have worked or would work. But what I would say is that the current environment that we're in, we are still working in a very siloed way. And I think, you know, if we talk about collaboration a lot, but what does it exactly look like and who's going to benefit from it? And just as a final point around the cost associated with that, obviously Beth highlighted some of the stats around the fact that the sellers would pay for it. It's also important for us to clarify along the system as to how cost effective the removal of the duplication of efforts, the removal of, you know, the time that's wasted, the reduction in PVQs, etc., would actually enable us as an industry to actually save money, work better together and improve that clarity. So I've answered Mike's way in a roundabout way, but I think condition-based advice is as critical for the consumer, and it's about us as an industry highlighting the importance of that as early on in the transaction process as possible.
Yeah, I'm not so sure the cost is as high as £300 right now in the room today. I mean, I don't know if there's any other providers of upfront information in the room that are offering these sorts of solutions, but personally, I know that, you know, we're less than £15.
I think what you're doing is that's not including the survey.
No, exactly. All the searches.
You need to be on the microphone. So
Oh,
that the
Mike, come on,
virtual
Mike.
Typically a survey might be £800, you know,
Yeah.
so that's a big chunk of money for someone to stump up. If you reverse the system and you go Scottish, you know, you have a home condition report. But I see, I've done this job for 30 odd years now, been chartered surveyor for 30 odd years. And I think it's a real, what you're doing is great, but I think it is bringing it together. I think we need to collaborate far more.
I think the trouble with this industry is that from experience...
Or profession, John.
Profession.
Just for those out there who prefer that word.
You have to take it in baby steps to bring everyone with you along that journey.
And that's a good point, John. You know, I see it as iterative. You know, I think we need to learn to trust the information that comes from the seller. We need to trust that what we can do, we can rely on, and that understanding the property data trust framework and how it can identify the provenance of that data. If you think currently only 20% of buyers will get a survey, that means that they don't have enough money to, or that they don't trust what the information that they're getting. So I think once we can prove to the consumer that by having information up front, it will improve things, and that they can trust the survey obtained by the seller, then we can move that way. But it is iterative. We've got to start with what we've got at the moment, what is available, and then it creates that wider bandwidth to bring in other things.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to one point. I think the other reason why they don't get condition-based advice is because they don't think they need it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the mortgage valuation process is incorporated in such a way. So I'll just echo some of the comments earlier about there's a huge educational piece associated with this, and the benefits that a consumer would get with having that upfront information.
And what about retrofit and net zero and cost of living crisis? You know, are people going to be more interested in understanding how energy efficient their house is, how what work that they can do? I mean, yes, they have the EPC, but that's very different from a condition report, which will say, you need to think what it's going to cost money on.
Can we just have the mic again? You might,
I've got a loud enough voice.
yeah, but no, they can't hear you online, Mike.
Oh, sorry,
And there's thousands waiting to hear you.
PAS 2035, I mean, we qualified to go out there and look at a retrofit situation. EPCs are notoriously inaccurate. You know, so, you know, we feel that if you had that information up front, you could have a very good information about a property, a Grade 2 listed building or a property in a conservation area. All that information that we're saying, we look for. In surveys, look for radon, flood risk, look at Japanese knotweed, try and find it, and you know, if it's behind the garden shed, for instance, or 3 metres in the next door's garden, etc. We look for all of that up front, so I think there's a lot of duplication.
That's it, yeah.
I just hope that that collaboration, it's baby steps, it's baby steps.
Yeah.
Oh, could you pass the microphone mic to Nigel, please?
Hello, it's Nigel Wally from Chimney. Just picking up on this issue around condition surveys, building on the great work that's gone on in the Upfront Information Group already, there's already a discussion within the group around what we're calling enhanced property data to do the same thing that's been done with BASPI, to create a property condition data set using PDTF. So this is already kicking off in the group. The PDTF team and the logbook team have been looking at this. The idea is to create, like BASPI, a data schema that can sit in a logbook or in other property records, and that surveyors, when doing a survey, can actually upload the data into a property record and not just produce a PDF. And I'm very heartened to hear Mike talk about collaboration.
Yeah.
There is a massive culture change needed, I think, in the surveying group. I'm sorry. The idea that you're just going to keep producing PDFs and store them and resell them 3 or 4 times to different people is over. We need to move to a world in which you're producing insight that's validated, and insight that's shared across these technical systems.
I would just echo that. I think when we're talking about the way we're doing things now, what could we improve, we also need to be mindful of the future generation, and that people are going to be more savvy, but actually people want to have that information readily available to them post-purchase, so as part of them maintaining that asset. As we do with the toaster. So I think it's absolutely critical. But again, bringing in collaboration here, if we are doing these things, there is a data standard that exists for for condition-based advice. And having that information readily available, not to just everybody as part of the transaction process, but to the consumer, that they can then go on and manage that asset effectively in a future-proof environment. Beth mentioned retrofit. So in an ideal environment, we would have that information readily available with the advice that the surveyor has provided in there. For example, when they're looking to do retrofits, the retrofit assessor's report is integrated in there, the coordinating is integrated in there, but also future environmental risks are integrated in there that are pertinent to the condition of the property and also pertinent to the value of the property. So this is the environment that the future consumer will expect us to operate in. And I think, obviously, it's already happening. We're all very passionate about it, but I think we do work in a siloed way. The profession works in a siloed way, and I think this is a great example of how we can remove some of these silos. Oh.
I just want to add a bit to this. I've had probably 4 or 5 discussions in the last 18 months with asset managers and with venture capital companies, looking at our industry across the piece about what do we invest in to engineer the change that has to happen to allow the firms we support to actually be really successful. So the discussions I'm having with them are about what are the blockers and how do they get the people who they see as the interrupters in the industry to get past that. And it's exactly this technology issue which they, as the real people who want to invest money in this industry, are trying to work out how to unpick all of these issues and invest in firms that are prepared to go there. Therefore, my view of this is not a nice to have, because if people stay with their head in their sand, like an ostrich, guess where their arse is? And therefore, you have to get to a point where you embrace this and think about how you're going to move with it and support it, as opposed to fight it. Because if we don't get there, the people who are, my job, I'm the head of a trade body. My job is to protect the commercial interests of the firms I represent. And that's Connell's Countrywide, it's a whole of LSL groups, a whole of other firms that are really core in all of this. My job is to protect their commercial interests. Therefore, I have to make sure that the environment they operate in is sustainable in the long term, and have the conversation with them, their chief execs and their front office directors, to move the industry forward in the right way. We're not doing this because it's fun. We're doing this because we actually want to have long-term sustainable businesses that work for everybody. And that's why the group, we are really passionate about this. But we have to do it from the perspective of how do we deliver it for the consumer that works best for them. If we keep that at the heart of it, then it all works beautifully. I'm sorry to take it in that direction, but
I
it's
think
really
it's absolutely right. I'll just add one comment that actually the future direction is the way that we consume homes is also going to change, and therefore the information that we want from that asset, is going to change. So I think it's absolutely critical to further highlight the importance of having condition-based advice, because you're going to need that if you want to use your asset in the way that you want to use it, which is where all the sustainability stuff, and don't get me started on that, will come in. So I think it's absolutely critical. It's not just because obviously we are extremely passionate about it, but it's because it's the right thing to do for our customers. And I think Glenn has said that right at the start, I think.
You came in at the right time there, Rob, because I was going to come to you and say often the broker is one of the first foot through the door as well. What do they understand about this? What is their appetite for this? And would they mention it to their clients?
The mortgage broker ultimately is driven, they're all driven by money at the end of the day. They want to get the transaction complete, and that's it. But if they can see a way that gives them greater certainty that this transaction will complete because it's simpler, quicker, easier, and if they're given the right tools to do the job, if it's complex and it's lots of bits of paper, don't even begin to think about it. If it's tech-driven, it's easy for them to start with a journey that says, that's the address, that's the postcode, that's the information sucked in, I just need you to fill in these other bits, then we bounce that across there. It works really well. The biggest problem I've probably got, and I'm open about this, my biggest problem is that actually it will work really well where the mortgage broker is working for the estate agent. The challenge I have is the mortgage brokers who then get really pissed off because that customer is taken away from them. My challenge back to them is, therefore, make sure you're wired into good estate agents and good technology, because that's the challenge. Now, my job as the trade body is to try to impel that change, not to be resistant to change, but to help them understand that we need to get away from this process where I've done my job and got the mortgage, it's down to everybody else to sort their shit out. That's not how it should work. They should be part of a fundamental part of that chain of gathering that information at the front end and feeding it into the systems that we all are trying to build on an integrated way, which will take time. But all of this is building the background and the standards and the structure that can then be automated. Unless we agree on all of this and build the standards and structure in the process, we'll never get there. So in answer to the question, are they ready? Nah. Can I get them ready? Yes, I can.
You heard it here first.
But it comes back to the sustainability issue as well. We're going to go through a huge issue on green. Head of the United Nations yesterday saying we're in the last chance saloon on green. The UK is 2% of world emissions. What we do doesn't matter. But we've got commitments as a country to change 20% of the emissions that are coming through UK property. We have to sort that shit out. And we will sort it out, but it will require lots of people in partnership working together to get there. And therefore, how we fund the change in people's properties in order to make them sellable. My favourite property pornography programme, Love It or List It. Phil Spencer, 3 weeks ago, sitting there flicking through property, he was circling the EPC rating on screen. That's the first time I've seen that in a major mainstream programme. That was messaging for the first time out of television about something. And we'll see that more and more. This is going to become mainstream, and we have to think about how we as an industry help deal with all of that, because unless that property is better, who's going to want to buy it? And we've got a task to deliver that.
Anybody else? Microphone for Claire, please. Oh, you've got it already. You brought your own. Excellent. Is that working okay at the back there?
Perfect. I'm just really, really keen, and I know Glynis and I have talked, and Kate, Beth and I have been talking about how we get this message to estate agents. The reason home information packs were such a painful bit at some point is that the estate agents that are going to be educating the clients as to how to do this themselves don't really understand enough. And I'm not meaning this in a patronising way, but there has to be a process and there has to be a route that each client is directed down by the main point of sale. And most people, when they think of selling their house, go to the agent first. They don't go to the lawyer first. So we're going to have to find a way of getting the agent to be really, really enthusiastic about this process, and enthusiastic even when it's faced with a condition report that may not put their property in the best light. Agents always want to market a property with the sun shining. They don't really want to be talking about it if it might be raining. So we've got to try and get them to embrace this as well as the clients, otherwise it's going to be really challenging.
One of the side questions that came in earlier is, how will we get estate agents to change their process so they encourage sellers to provide upfront information? So obviously that was going to go to Glynis to start with, and then maybe you'd like to say something as well, Claire.
Well, I think that, you know, there is a push amongst estate agency to try to get the conveyancer instructed on day one. And if the conveyancer is instructed on day one, statistically, we can show that that saves about 3 weeks. If that conveyancer then immediately starts to produce a file, you know, with all the information. If you talk to any estate agent, most will say, well, of course, you can only ever move as the slowest in the chain. And of course, as we all know, it is the conveyancer that slows it down. That isn't true, because what we can show from all the work that we've done with those that have engaged and those that haven't is if you instruct that conveyancer on day one, it will save you time for that conveyancer to start producing a file. Without question, it will. What we actually have to do, though, is we do have to, I absolutely agree with you, Claire, we do absolutely have to educate people so that they understand the process. I agree with what you were saying, Anna. I think some consumers actually don't understand the difference between a lender survey and, you know, the home condition report. And I agree with you, Mike. I think there should be, but we've got to start somewhere. So we've got to educate people. We've got to work better together, because we only work at our best when we work together, and it is all about the customer. So what platforms can we use to make sure that we educate estate agents, because they are generally the first that people, you know, go to? What platforms can we use for them? And of course the consumer. We have got to educate the consumer as well, so that the pressure starts to come from the bottom up and not just the top down. So, you know, it's all of you that have got websites, it's portals, you know, it's, yes, newspapers, and obviously it's things like this. This is the first one, and it will be the first of many, because Beth's really enjoyed organising it. And so I can, you know, I'm looking forward to seeing all the others. And of course, Rob will be there doing that.
Oh, I'm looking forward to all those travel lodges.
Rob, can I just add in there? I mean, I started as an estate agent, and the idea that an estate agent would worry about having something negative about the property, I think just doesn't exist. Because I remember being an estate agent and walking into properties and just loving it if there was a dodgy kitchen or it needed decorating, because I knew full well that I'd be ringing up people who would buy it and going, you're going to get a bargain, and there's work needs doing, but it's got so much potential. And when you watch location, all those programs you love, you know, what do they say? Oh, you know, that you're looking at it going, it's falling down, and the agent's going, oh, the potential here, you can move everything around, you can take out these walls. It will be exactly the same with upfront information. If there's something iffy in there, they'll say, it's a short lease, you're going to get an absolute bargain. And that's what estate agents do. That's what they're great at. They're taking things and using them as sales techniques. And yes, Claire, we need to educate them that is that opportunity that it brings to them. And if they do that, then it means that the person that buys that property or offers on that property is the right one for it. So it's not going to fall out halfway through.
We've got some people in the audience champing at the bit here. Can we have a microphone for Ed, please, at the front here? Could you just say who you are and where you're from, please, Ed?
Hi, I'm Ed Molyneux. Some of you might know me. I'm a participant on the Home Buying and Selling Group Tech subgroup, which is very exciting. So I'm quite close to the schemas and also the Property Data Trust Framework, and I'm also co-founder at a new startup called Moverly. We're building digital property packs, as are others. So there's two things that occur to me. One of them is a bit of a sort of chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Because at the moment there aren't really tools out there, and I know John's team's working hard on building them, and we're working hard on building them, to actually give people the tools required to pull this stuff together as simply as they could do. And so as these products go into the market, now you'll have agents being able to point at different tools and say, this is how you actually engage with that, and we're a little bit short on that. And the other thing is, from an education point of view, I think one of the things that appears to me is that things like HBSG, UFI, BASB aren't consumer-friendly brands, and PDTF is even worse. It's a technical standard which nobody should care about. Spare. So people have talked about property pack ready, listing ready, contract ready, sale ready, buyer ready, move ready. I wonder if we need to actually cohere around something that we can point at and say you should be sale ready, and it can be a badge that goes on to Rightmove that says this property is property pack ready, is sale ready, whatever. Just have one thing, and then people can get their heads around it, because at the moment there isn't really a single place to hang anybody's branding hat on.
Yeah, a bit like a kite mark.
Yeah.
Well, if Emma's still listening from Trading Standards, maybe they could create a badge that could go on.
Well, Glynis has been working hard on this, actually. Do you want to tell them about the PR campaign and the meeting that we had with the marketing?
We absolutely recognise what everybody's been saying, you know, that we've got to be sort of a bit more upfront in terms of educating people. So we had a marketing away day, if you like, a couple of weeks ago. And I had approached a marketeer, and I was telling her about the different things that Home Buying and Selling Group did and have done, and she was absolutely blown away by what we've done, and absolutely goes back to, you know, what Ed was saying then. Really, we need to encompass it into something that is easy for everybody to recognise, for the consumer, for everybody in the industry, so that we would have some kind of a, you know, sort of a strapline or a kite mark, for want of a better expression, that says this is the standard that should be expected for every property. So when the consumer goes and sees this standard, then they would know exactly what was in it. So that's all sort of work in progress.
And originally, when we were looking at this, the civil servant from the department identified it as property pack available, and having that as a logo. So if anybody's got any opinions on that, please put it on Slido, or any better ideas.
Alan, you've been very patient. If you could just take the mic from Ed, please.
Thank you. So Alan Milstein from the Residential Property Surveyors Association. A few months ago, I was at the launch of the the New Homes Quality Board in the House of Commons, and I think it was the first event for Lucy Fraser, who was the new housing minister. And it was the first event that she was there, and they took lots of nice photos, and 2 days later she was gone. So we do seem to have had a succession of housing ministers coming and going. We've also had the regulation of property agents sitting in the legal dustbin for quite a few years now. And so there seems to be a complete lack of will within government to do something positive here. So I wonder, what is the general view? Do we want government intervention? Do we want government legislation? Because if we look at the areas you mentioned, like Scotland, where we have the Home Report and we have the Home Information Packs, of course, they were the result of legislation, and that's probably the primary reason we say people are happy to pay for them. Well, they had to, so there was no choice. So I just wonder what people's views are about how much do we want government input and
Let's go to you first, Robert, because you were shaking your head vigorously there. So,
no, I mean, I think the challenge of having sold a property in Scotland, I put my mother into care. It was really interesting to go through the process because I hadn't been there for such a long time, and I'd had to learn the process. But it was interesting because actually it was my lawyer who gave me his agent, who then did all the work, and it just was really smooth and simple. And there was a fee, which actually wasn't collected until the house was sold. So although it is upfront, technically, actually it depends on whether they trust you or not. So it depends where you are in that process. For me, the compulsion debate is one that I think runs across the home buying and selling quite a lot, and our debate and interaction with the department is interesting about that, because I think we probably, like many things we do when we talk to the civil servants, they do get it and they do understand, and we have traction with them. The problem is how we then get that into a minister to get traction, to get political time within any structure of getting legislation passed. The only way that will happen will be if actually the industry starts to lobby their own MPs. The only way you ever get time is this becomes a question for the minister from MPs. You know something's bad when you can go to House of Commons Library and find stuff on it. Because the stuff that I suddenly struggle with in the market, I go to House of Commons Library, have a look. Funnily enough, if it's there, it means MPs are being asked questions about it by their constituents, or they're being lobbied by their constituents, and we're all constituents. But we've never got very good, I don't think, at how we use the power we all have, individually and collectively, to get that on the agenda. And that's something I think the group will have to think about, and Glynis and I will talk about more as we go forwards, about how we engineer that change. So I think that's the challenge, is compulsion is the only way this will work, because voluntary, actually, it's easier. There will always be somebody who will do it for cheaper or less, or tell somebody, you don't need that. Because that lowest common denominator, that's still got that bundle of legal documents that you're really, really clinging on to, will be in that space. And that's quite important for me, is that actually it's only when government tells the country that this is important, they should do it, will actually the consumer believe I should be doing this as well.
So Beth, thinking about mandation, how mandated is the mandation coming from material information?
And
it's not legislation strictly, is it?
No, it is. You know, there is regulation there that says it has to be done, but up until now there was no guidance, so nothing that they could pin their hat against and go, you've not met this. Now, Emma's probably listening virtually going, that's not quite like that, but I'm going to tell you what the law says, which says there are unlimited fines and prison sentences. So whilst at the moment, national trading standards are working with industry and collaborating with industry to ensure that they get this through the portals and the CRM systems and everything else, realistically, there will be a time at which they're going to have to enforce. At the moment, it's collaborate, but it will become enforced, because whilst we've got all the lovely engaged stakeholders in the room and on virtually, there are, as we know, thousands upon thousands who have no idea about anything. They are not even registered with HMRC as an estate agent. We've got conveyancers who are just so nose down trying to get on with the files one after another that they don't have time to understand that this is coming down the track. And we do need to reach out to them, and that's the purpose of these roadshows, and trying to get people together, property networks together, to talk about it and say it is a legal obligation. We can dob in our competitors if we want, but actually it'd be better if we just get on and we all agree to do it. The legislation is there. We've also got the same civil servants that we've had all the way through, and they not all the way through, they have changed a lot, but they too want to see this delivered, and they're impartial. So it doesn't matter if we have a change in government or a change in minister, they're still taking this through, but they have to brief a new minister every time before they can get anything actually legislated. But as Robert says, unless people are lobbying via their local MP, there's no wake-up call to the minister that's come in to understand that there is an issue that needs resolving. And because they had the call for evidence back in 2018, and Kate created the home buying and selling group to help, there's sort of a nod from ministers, oh, well, they've got it covered. We're not getting complaints anymore. So unless you all complain, we're not going to get the legislation, but we don't need the legislation. What we need is to get on with this and have the balls to deliver it, because we know it works.
But it's not actually, sorry, I'll come to a second. It's not actually a legal obligation on the conveyancer, and it's not a legal obligation to provide a seller's pack, is it? But it should lead on to that.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly. And the point is there is a legal obligation on the estate agent. As we've already said, there is a legal obligation on the seller to provide that information. And as I say, the SPS Groundworks case last year absolutely confirms that.
Sorry, Anna.
No, I was just going to say that whether it's mandated or not, I think doing the best service possible to the consumer will drive that industry transformation into that direction of travel, regardless of whether the legislation exists or not. I think there needs to be a massive cultural shift in a lot of these things, and I think the government's also expecting the industry to provide some of these solutions, and I think this is a solution that can support that journey, and consumers will expect us to better collaborate regardless of whether there's a legislation in place or not. So I think some of these changes need to happen for that change to then become mandated or legislated. I just think it's about the way that we all work and what the expectations of us from our customers will be in the future as well.
And if you were the Labour government coming in next year potentially, would you be saying, well, actually, the Conservatives scrapped home information packs, which was our legislation. But if we bring it back, we've got all of this updated, we've got all the technology that can deliver it now, so that all of the issues that people identified and the unintended consequences of home information pack have been solved. Are they going to go back to that? It seems quite likely that they might, given that the legislation was only suspended, it hasn't been cancelled. So,
and also we've got an upskilled property industry waiting out there to do this. So I think, you know, it's important for us to start driving that change, because I think we're an industry that we can.
Emma has kindly commented, Beth, it's up to 2 years custodial sentence and unlimited fines, so pretty severe, really.
Yep, absolutely.
It's the carrot and the stick, though, isn't it, with all of this? I mean, you know, it's given the market the opportunity to embrace and adopt something and sort of more or less self-regulate themselves. You know, yeah, mandation is the ultimate, I suppose, but I think you'll be waiting an awful long time for legislation and mandation. Meanwhile, everyone in the room and online potentially will still be bitching and moaning about, you know, it's his fault, it's her fault, it's that side's fault, there's lack of collaboration, rather than embracing a great opportunity to use an initiative like this that's going to benefit everyone across the transaction.
I'm just going to read out a comment from the room and then a question that came in on Slido. So somebody in the room has posted, surely as soon as estate agents realise they can, 1, make money out of this, and 2, get their commission, they should be all over it. And then the question came in earlier from Slido. During the days of HIPS, estate agents charged sellers, and many were found to abuse the process. Will they do this again? So will agents mark up the cost of anything that is put together, do you think, Glynis?
I think that I couldn't sit here and say they would never do that. I mean, it's only a couple of weeks ago that somebody, a major high street name, was charging £60 for digital ID. So I could not sit here and say that, you know, agents wouldn't do that. And you would hope not, but certainly, you know, at the time that HIPS were about, it saved some agents, HIPS. I do, though, believe in mandation. I absolutely believe that the government should do it, and I believe that the government should do it because their first priority is to keep us safe and away from war. Their second priority is to make sure that the population has somewhere to live and they have a roof over their head. So I absolutely believe the government should mandate. Whether the government will or not, I don't know, but I agree with everybody else in the panel and everybody else in the audience that says that we've got to, you know, sort of provide the platform that will make change happen. And yes, we will always do our best to do it internally and, you know, to be self-aware and try to, you know, credit the industry with that. But I absolutely believe the government should mandate it.
Thank you.
And do bear in mind that Michael Gove did reference the upfront information, the home buying and selling group, in his Levelling Up white paper. And it was just unfortunate that he was sacked before he got to set out his strategy, and then having come back into government, it obviously has a different direction to go off in now. So we've almost got there so many times, but...
We have. Nigel's got the mic again, so Nigel.
Yeah, picking up on something Anna said, quite rightly, I think she's called out the need for cultural change across the industry. And it's not just about embracing tech, whatever that vague phrase means. I set up Chimney because I bought a house, went through a reasonably digitally literate process where everybody involved in the chain, the estate agents and conveyancers, were all very digitally literate. At the end of the process, I was handed a set of keys and an old box of documents, but every single professional in the chain had a CRM system absolutely full of information about my property, and I had nothing. And that's why I started Chimney. There has to be a change in the way we look at the data that's being created through this process, because the data doesn't belong to any of you on the panel. The data doesn't belong to the estate agents and the conveyancers. The data belongs to the property. We have to start looking at data as an asset, and that data has to accrue to a property. There has to be this digital deed pack that Beth has mentioned a couple of times. And that digital deed pack should grow over time. With every transaction in which everyone in the room participates data, that deed pack should get richer and deeper and should be available when the homeowner chooses to release the data That data should be available to any professional in the chain that they choose to share it with. But at the moment, what we've got is a group of professionals looking to fill their CRMs with better data to make them better, not to make the data asset better. And I would refer you to the classic car market. If you have a classic car, it has between a 30 and 50% premium if you've got a really good provenance and a logbook. If you put a classic car into an auction without one, it's almost valueless compared to the other cars. And we have to get to that way with property because data is valuable. And if we're creating data about property, which has value, that value shouldn't accrue to the professionals who are doing it. It should accrue to the asset. And the only way we're going to achieve that is with property logbooks that can produce the deeds packs we've talked about.
Could you pass the mic back one row to the lady at the back there, please? It's not a relay race, thank God.
My name's Alicia. I'm a solicitor from Landsmith Solicitors. We are a CQS accredited firm, so obviously we have protocol to follow. There seems to be a little bit of a contradiction between protocol and the role that the buyer and seller's solicitor would follow with that, and the upfront information pack as to who should be doing what. Are there plans that this will be incorporated with the protocol and with the Law Society, or is it going to be you're either CQS accredited or you provide the upfront information?
Great question.
So the CQS protocol says that you have to use the most up-to-date Law Society forms, but it doesn't say that you have to use the Law Society forms. So long as you're gathering that data that is necessary for you to complete your due diligence, then that will satisfy your regulator. The moment that CQS start enforcing the use of those forms, it then becomes a regulatory body, and at that point has to be passed to the SRA for them to do as a regulator. So that's not going to happen. Now, if you do a new build, you don't get, you often will transact without the TA10 coming through. You will use whatever the new build developer gives you. It's exactly the same as that. So the regulators will say, so long as you're acting in the best interest of your client and you have undertaken the due diligence, then you will meet your regulatory requirements. So I think you're quite safe to accept the BASB. On top of that, we've done a lot of work to ensure that the BASB is always able to pre-populate the Law Society forms. And in fact, Law Society, if you have a look on their website, they do reference the BASB and upfront information. And they have done their own pilot on a sort of part 1 TA6, recognising upfront information, very positive about it. I haven't heard what's come out of that pilot, but the point is they're absolutely on board with the home buying and selling group and the delivery of the improvements to the home moving process.
Does that answer your question? That's a nod. Good. Thank you. I want to try and get to, unless anyone's got any questions from the audience. Anyone want the mic? Desperately?
I wouldn't mind coming back and just commenting on Nigel's point.
Yeah, please, John. Yeah. That's what you're here for, John.
Property and data, because he's absolutely right in terms of you've got the property asset and all of the information relating to that property is insight on that asset. You know, if you look at the world of conveyancing searches, you know, traditionally that's all been paper document driven, PDF type driven. Well, that's changing right now. You know, there are providers in the room today that can serve up the data points about a property report into a legal case management system so that, you know, the technology can consume that information and serve it to a fee earner as digital content for them to make an informed decision and advise their client rather than, you know, perusing over 30, 40, 50 pages of a PDF document, because that's a bit old hat, isn't it? So we're certainly on that journey, 100%, that, you know, the idea that in, don't know how many years' time, where it's commonplace that when you actually go to list your property with the estate agent, you're effectively giving them a digital key to your property passport, and it's got all of the information there that can be shared straight away. And again, it'll just, you know, it'll just improve the whole process.
And that does exist in other jurisdictions. You know, you've got building passports that are very effective in continental Europe, for example. But again, I'll just go back to the point about people's perception and how they want to consume their asset, which is their home of the future. And I think at the moment, consumers and the industry as well treat the process very linear, which is why I love Beth's diagram about the information being pinged across everybody, because it shouldn't be as linear as you've instructed so-and-so, you've got so-and-so. In an ideal environment, you'd want, just like you're instructing the conveyancer on day one, you want the surveyor to come in on day one, because they will have the information available for that particular transaction, and you as a consumer will get that condition-based advice as early on as possible to avoid, so that it gives you the reassurance of what you're buying. But then if you have a property passport of the kind, it has all of the condition-based information. Well, yes, I'm using the property passport word, the property logbook, but it also has condition-based advice that we talked about earlier on, and the surveyor can come in and see what potential issues might be with the property moving forward, and how the property would be utilised in the future. So I think it's just about cultural change about how we operate, but also a shift in the way that the transaction process is treated.
Yeah, love a car analogy. Can't beat it, because let's face it, you know, if you go to the forecourt tomorrow, you want to know that the car's got an MOT, it's valid, in date, and there's provenance behind all of those MOT certificates as to the mileage and all the rest of it, and the service history. So, you know, and that's for a second-hand car, let alone a £300,000 property. I mean, it's just bonkers, isn't it, really? We all know it's bonkers.
And that's below the average price.
Yeah, whereas the 300,000.
Exactly, yeah.
Anyone else from the audience got anything? Somebody posted this on Slido earlier, and I wanted to come to the question of cost as well. So they've said, will vendors have to pay for the LPE1 form prior to marketing and then pay again when the validity of this expires? So with that in mind, what will be the cost of the pack, and who will pay, and when will they pay, do you think, Beth?
So with the LPE1, we didn't specifically reference that within the finite prescribed documents. The reason being that until government deliver the legislation that they have promised, that the LPE1 can only be charged at cost with no more than £200 and then a £50 refresher fee, there was no need to put it in there, although it is authority data, shall we say. Instead, a TA7, the Law Society's leasehold information form, could be used by the seller to gather that information and to provide that information to the buyer. The issue then is that you do have that hiccup later if the LPE1 reveals something different. So again, it's iterative, and the moment where we hear of LPE1s being charged at £600 and ridiculous things like that, that is a problem, and we don't want people stuck in that postcode lottery. And with the leasehold, it's hard enough at the moment to find anybody who'll act for you because of all the issues with building safety. So these are things that, again, will need to come down the track. The government, as I say, have already promised that they will mandate the costing around these things. And we have got the Leasehold Reform Part 2 bill going into Parliament. So we're hoping that in the King's speech that he will identify that as moving forward, and also hopefully some of the work in the home buying and selling group. So if you think of all the Law Commission reports on common hold enfranchisement, right to manage, plus regulation of property agents, and all the amazing work that Lord Best did with his working group on that, then fingers crossed we might see something coming down the track.
But the general cost of the pack, I mean, you touched on this, I think, earlier, John. You said you could provide a pack for as little as £15 without searches and survey, I guessed. And if you put the searches in the survey in, then that's going to go up an awful lot. Where's this going to pan out? How's that going to work with conveyancers? What do you suggest they should charge, or pack providers?
Well, we
anybody?
can't talk about that, Rob. That would make us a cartel. So can we be a bit careful about that?
I think it's a hypothetical question.
I think we have to recognise that this is a commercial decision of each provider. But we know that consumers are happy to pay for it. It is cost neutral. Most people are buying and selling, and they would much prefer, and certainly in the surveys that we did, they would much prefer to be paying on a property that they were selling and that they knew they were selling, rather than paying on a property that they may or may not be able to purchase. So we know that they're okay with that. As I mentioned, 78% were fine paying over £300, but actually the levels that we asked were, would you pay £300, would you pay the X amount, would you pay whatever it cost? And I was stunned at how many people said that they would pay whatever it cost to get that information. So I don't think we should belittle the consumer by thinking that they wouldn't put their hand in the pocket, wouldn't understand how important it is. And of course, we're taking the cost from the first-time buyer, which doesn't, you know, they've saved up God knows how many years to be able to get a deposit together, let alone all the search costs and the survey if they're going to have one, and the mortgage product fee and all of that. And we're moving that cost from the first-time buyer to the seller who is realising an asset, liquidating it, and is going to get hundreds of thousands of pounds in the bank.
But all those benefits, I agree with all that, all those benefits have to be explained to the seller by the agent and or the broker, don't they? And how are they going to do that? Will they do that?
Well, it's engagement, same as a lawyer does now.
But also they manage it all the time with EPCs and with, you know, brochures and stuff like that. You know, the estate agents don't go along and go, yeah, it's going to cost you nothing to put it on the market. Do they, Glynis?
Well, I mean, it is still no sale, no fee, isn't it, as far as an estate agent's concerned. But where agents are doing this contract-ready, sale-ready, working alongside a conveyancer and so on, there is a charge. And the agent and the conveyancer has to explain the charge. And that will vary from conveyancer to conveyancer, because going back to Beth's point, it can't be a closed shop. So some charge 750, some charge 150, you know, that's up to their commercial model. But in order to get that money from a vendor, there has to be a good reason. The vendor wants to know, well, why are you taking the money? What does that mean to me? And that means somebody has to explain it and explain it properly. And the ones that are successful in getting that money up front are the ones that are best at explaining it.
Thank you. Robert, what about from the broker's point of view? Are they able to do that, or will they be, as you said you were going to educate them on this?
I think it's one of those things where the good ones will and the bad ones won't. It's no different to where we are in the landscape we live in. And it will depend on their relationship, I think, with where their leads come from. So if they're tied in close to the estate agent and they're part of that process, yes, they will have to do this. Because for me, this is, if I'm a consumer coming to sell my house and I have an agent or a broker in front of me who says, look, the best chance you're getting the best price for your property is if you do all of this, and it's going to cost you £1,000 up front on a £500,000 property that I'm trying to sell, and the agent's going to tell me, well, actually, you know, we're going to put it on the market for 520. If we get on for 500, you probably should take it. And I'm arguing about investing £1,000 up front to maybe optimise that. If you've got a good agent and a good broker who's talking to people in those terms, then you've got a right value equation about why you should do this, i.e., you do this as a customer because it gets you to the place where you've got the best chance of this completing with somebody who's looking to buy it, who knows that what they're buying, what the issues are, and is it suitable for them. That's the key here of stopping this, as we said up front, the aborted transaction where something pops out in the woodwork later which nobody knew about or should have known about but kept undisclosed. And therefore, it's about having transparency. And it really is straightforward about that for me. And good people will do it, and the people who engage with it who want to be good at it will do it. The people who actually want to make sure they earn more because they just actually are good at their job, guess what? They'll do it. The best mortgage brokers I know do all of this almost instinctively anyway. The bad ones don't. And I can't legislate for those, but I can try and make the world easier and easier through all the work that's been done here to build up higher standards, automation and delivery of property logbooks. Yes, please, I'd love one on my property because when I come to sell it, it will be much easier. All of these things, as a consumer, I fundamentally believe in. If I believe in it as a consumer, if I don't believe it as a consumer, why would I be promoting it in this world? And therefore, that's the fundamental for me here. And so that's the answer to the question. Do I think I can educate them? Yes, I can. The other bit of this is going to get interesting, where a little bit further down the line, what we're going to have is people will have done certain things to their property and not got to an EPC C or better. And we can debate whether EPCs are the right thing or wrong, it doesn't matter. When they've done that work to make it more comfortable, they'll invest it in it. Where do they record that and how do they show that they've done the work and paid for it, unless we build stuff like this that helps them get there? Otherwise, it's going to drop into where? And therefore, this will become more and more important, that we have these electronic systems that track money that's been invested and been surveyed or been agreed and been confirmed, that therefore, when you come to sell or remortgage, you get a tick in the box and move on easily. These are going to be essential things as we go through the next 5 years.
I mean, those early adopters will use it, of course, from an estate agent's point of view, to sell against their competitors because they're adding value. And they're doing it already. And, you know, Claire will comment on this. She'll either agree or disagree with me. But, you know, the good agents are doing this already. Some of them are going out to land registry and downloading a set of office copies before they go out on listing, and they're just taking that £6 off on the chin because they know that actually without doing it in that way, each and every listing that they're taking based on a quick, you know, market appraisal, 40 minutes in and out, is probably costing them their business in the long term. Much more than it's costing them £6 to go in there armed with some fairly basic rudimentary information and to, you know, kind of upsell their service to build trust at a very early stage to win that listing. You know, why is it that an agent might come around and I agree to list with them at 1.5% versus two other agents that were perhaps offering 1%? You know, it's not just about the price, is it? It's about everything else.
Yeah, okay. I know if I was still out there doing conveyancing, I would be going around to my agents now and saying, you know, material information is coming, I'd like to help you with that, and why don't we talk about developing some kind of seller's pack at the same time? And again, from my point of view, from an ex-conveyancer's point of view, I would much rather spend the time putting a pack together before a buyer's been found than after a buyer's been found, because I haven't got the world and the wife chasing me for that pack and those documents. It's there, it's on the shelf waiting to go out when the buyer is found. Happy days.
Yeah, and I think there's a responsibility on both sides, really, in terms of conveyancers as well as the estate agent, and what a week to talk about this, because you know, there's an awful lot of conveyancers that are very reliant on referred work from the high street. So again, circling back round to that sort of collaboration, but you know, if the conversation around upfront information is bi-directional, so the conveyancers are talking to their referrers, introducing the work to them about the need and the sort of setting the baseline standard. If you want to work with us and introduce work to us, this is sort of, we're setting our stall out, this is how we want to work, because these are the benefits from us as a lawyer and the service that we can deliver to the consumer and to you as the introducer. I think that will also go a long way to sort of help and educate and break down some of the barriers.
Okay, thanks, John. We're getting close to time now. Emma's posted again and said, don't forget that any fees must include VAT. So just pointing that out. And then someone said, is there some suggestions that findings from condition-based surveys are included in the BASB? Has any consideration been given to the liability of the surveyor? So one for you, Anna.
If the condition-based advice is incorporated in them, it's more about the questions that a surveyor would ask up front. I think the liabilities don't necessarily change for a surveyor, because the surveyor will still have to go in and inspect the property and provide the advice based on the condition of the property. It's more about bringing that added level of consistency in terms of the information that the surveyor needs to have up front before going into the property, to give them property-specific information to enable them to give the best advice to their customer.
Okay, thank you. Microphone here, please, if we could. Chap at the front, thanks. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, I'm Nitin Agarwal, founder and CEO of Property Deals Insight. So first of all, it's been really good debate, very useful information. So we, as a platform, provide data into over 28 million homes, and we've been doing it for landlords and agents so far. But what advice do you have for somebody like us, where we want to be helping organizations which would need some of this data? Because I think we do already hold most of this information, and we're also recently become part of the home buying and selling group. also been helping contribute. But is there any way we can actually help contribute better to make a real change and expedite some of this?
I mean, you've got to remember that material information is just as relevant in letting property as it is in selling the property. So what you're doing is fantastic. And I would say you need to speak to some of the people in this room because actually putting that into, for example, a property logbook so that anybody buying the property then has the opportunity to engage with that information. Because of course, you know, when you're getting this information about your home move, actually all you're really talking about is, can I use the house as I want to? Is it all going to be okay for me? But we transact with properties all the way through our ownership, whether it's a remortgage, whether it's letting it out, or whether it's doing something else with it, extending, altering, whatever. So having this information available digitally is going to be magical for consumers whilst they're in their property. It's not just about getting it to buy or let a property. It's about using that data to improve your property, your ownership and your enjoyment of that property during the whole time that you engage with it. And it's really interesting when you think about property now, certainly when I started, like Rob and I will always talk about, you know, it was all bits of paper and it was all about whether you could park a white van on it. Now we have to think about smart homes. We have to think about making sure that we've got the password for the boiler hub, for the UFI doorbell, for the CCTV cameras. And so it's not just the paperwork that needs to be digital. Properties are becoming digital. And we need the technology to enable people to get all of that information about the property. We've not talked about the unique property reference number today, but I can bore everybody for days on that. But the ability then to be able to attach that to property, and certainly the RLBA, RLBA, I always get the wrong way around, have created a register to ensure that there is only one property logbook per UPRN, but links to the bigger UPRN. So if you've got a building and you have a flat in there, then they will be linked through the UPRNs, which means that when you've got legislation like the building safety regulations that have just come out requiring a leaseholder's deed of certificate and a landlord certificate, actually being able to plug those into that property data schema means that people in years to come will still be able to access those and find out whether they have the relevant protections against the cost of remediation for cladding or whatever.
I'll just bring in just a little element of sustainability.
We are running short on time.
Right on time.
That's fine.
But having real live data, I think, is going to be critical in the way that you use your property, particularly around environmental impact and the negative environmental impact that your property might have. We talked about the property being smart, what about electric charges, solar panels, everything else that comes associated with it. And I think consumers of the future will want to be able to navigate their usage or their consumption of their property, but also, given the cost of living and everything else associated with it, that's going to be critical information for all occupiers and consumers.
Okay, thank you. I think Emma wants the last word. She's posted, and I'll just read it as it is, referral fees need to be disclosed, please.
Well, that's in the law already, so everybody knows that if there's a referral fee, it needs to be notified up front that there's one.
She's posting again, hold on. Oh, great session, very well done. I haven't read this myself yet, so Kustith I'm being bad, but great session, very well done. If anyone thinks of any questions for me, please email estate.agency@paris.gov.uk. Email me and I'll pass that on. So we're done for time. Thanks to the audience, thanks to the people out there. Big round of applause, I think, for the panel. Can we please produce sellers packs, whatever they're called, before I drop off my purse? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Definitely. Well done, Rob. Well done to Rob.
Well done.